This Choircast podcast is brought to you by my book, God, Sex, and Rich People, A Recovering Evangelical Testimony. What happens when an evangelical pastor's daughter moves from Branson, Missouri to the Big Apple? A collapse of identity that begins a journey of figuring out faith, fucking, and the 1%. I wrote this book so I could share with humor and raw honesty the realities of reinventing my spirituality and sexuality in the city that never sleeps and never stops sleeping around. Available now on Amazon.
Well, g'day, dear listeners. Here we are, another episode of I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. Troy, what's happening?
NFL's kicked off for the year, and as I get older, I'm becoming more and more butch. Because you know me, years ago, I would have gone football. That's a sport, isn't it? And now all of a sudden, I'm like decked out. I mean, you can't see it right now, listener, but I'm totally decked out. I'm ready for the season. And yesterday I put the mud guards on my car, right? Next thing you know, I'm going to be voting Conservative. This is just insane.
I think you're on the edge. And I can see you've decked out in your beloved Cowboys gear. But also, Troy, you quite often call me and go, oh, fuck, what do I do about this with my car, whatever. You have gone totally butch. Like a few weeks ago, you needed a new tail light for your wife's car. You bought it. You said, Brian, I've got no idea how to put this on. Then I get a call going, not only did I put this on, but I had to solder shit and I'm pretty sure after you did it, you crushed a beer can with your teeth.
Yeah, that's right. Instead, I sat back and watched NASCAR. I know, it was insane, and yet here I am. I seriously, I think it's something about getting older. I've just become more macho. And so I'm quite proud of myself. I actually send pictures to family members who used to tease me about reading too many books, going, look, I just fixed the car. Look, I just fixed the car again. Go Cowboys. Yeah, it's a thing. I think there's some trauma in there, to be honest.
Back in the day, you would have had to read a book to do that, to learn how to do it. But now you can just go straight to YouTube, which is great.
That's correct. So,
but enough. No,
enough Bart and Megan. Enough Bart and Megan. Let's talk about our guests. I'm very excited because we're always excited. Don't get too full of yourself, guys. We get very excited about everyone that comes on our show. But it's the Mayfields, Brian. It's the Mayfields. They're back. Here comes a fun episode.
It's going to be lots of fun. But also catching up. We were just having a little bit of a chit chat beforehand and going, when was the last time we had you on? And it's 15 months ago. So it's actually a lot of time has passed. A lot has changed. A lot has happened podcast wise in their lives. And we're really looking forward to having a chat about that. So Danielle, Krispin, welcome.
Thanks. It's so great to be back.
Super, super great to be here.
I think you're the only people that have us on podcasts anymore.
Yeah, we don't really love doing them.
Yes.
And nor do we get invited.
You're right.
So that's
something about like leaving Christianity and
something like blowing up our entire lives and careers makes people a little
less likely to invite you on a podcast
to us.
Yeah. So we're very glad to be invited.
I'm looking forward to picking up on a little bit of a comment just there, Krispin, because last time we had you on, you're like, yeah, I'm still a Christian. Yeah. Sitting on the edge. And if Jesus comes back right now, I reckon I'll be taken. But you just said.
That was what we talked about before we started recording was like, if the rapture happens, who's going to be still sitting here? And we weren't sure. Maybe it was just the three of you. But I will make a confession of non-faith and say that I definitely have left Christianity.
So, like, are you fear-free, or do you still, like me, dare not blaspheme the Holy Spirit, whatever that means? Like, I can't say those words, the Holy Spirit, because there's just this little part of me that goes, oh. Are you that free, or are you still fucked up?
Those are the two options.
Yeah, if there's two options, let me tell you which one you're in. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, let's hear from you.
Just kidding, no.
Definitely in the fucked up category. It's funny because you're asking me a question that's sort of getting into it. Right before I left Christianity, I'd gotten to this point of like, I can do whatever and God will always love me and loves me unconditionally. And there's nothing I can do. So, which actually sort of like allowed me, I think, to take those steps. Like I didn't believe in hell when I was a Christian, like, so it kind of allowed me some of that like anxiety, because I think that's such a common thing for people leaving faith. I kind of worked through some of that anxiety within Christianity that made it a little bit easier to leave. Yeah. Now I have a question of like, what's the point of life? So, now
Crispin's onto the existential crises that, you use religion to bypass those for a while. So that's always fun to be hit.
I now use the NFL and fixing cars for what it's
I can
worth.
see that, Troy. I can see that. How fun for you. Is that a great way to get out some of those emotions too? You just
Totally. And it's also, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, it's a special interest kind of thing, right? So I can get right into it. There's stats, there's all kinds of things in there. So yes.
Unlike you guys who've got unhealthy obsessions, I just rely on drugs and alcohol. So I'm fine. You guys need
You're
to try
doing
that.
great. You're doing great.
Thank you.
Love that.
Although you are a season pass holder to the Australian football, Brian, aren't you?
I certainly am. Many, many, many seasons in. I have my own seats at the great stadium, the Melbourne Cricket Ground. And yeah, I do worship football for 6 months of the year. So we're sort of opposite sides of the year, Troy. When AFL finishes, NFL takes off. So
yeah,
we've got a whole year of football between us.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, look, enough about football, because not everybody loves it. And I'm looking at these two guys and I've got a feeling their eyes are glazing over. But let's talk about what we're here to talk about today, right? And that is neurodivergence in church. Because, guys, I don't know if you've been following our pod, and I know you haven't, but that's okay. I have recently been given an ADHD diagnosis. And what happened was my son was in his session with his counselor or with his psychologist, and my wife and I are sitting there and they're going, well, these are the symptoms, tick, 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 and they're going through, and I'm just going, yep. And actually, when they got to the rejection sensitive dysphoria one, that for me was just like, oh, that's totally been me my whole life. And so I went and got a diagnosis, and it wasn't hard. It was really funny because when I read my own diagnosis referral thing back to my doctor from the psychiatrist, he says he didn't sit still the whole time. And I was like, really? I really thought I did, And so, yeah, anyway, so that's that. And I actually thought of you, Danielle, when this happened, because I thought Danielle was saying that she was, coming to her own diagnosis of autism. And so I thought you're just going to have a lot to say about neurodivergence and autism and ADHD and other things as well. And so I thought, let's get the Mayfields on and talk about this. And so it may turn out to be some sort of therapy session for me. That may be where this goes. And that's why, Crispin, it's really good to have you here as a licensed specialist, and also Brian, who's also a licensed specialist. But yeah, guys, I would just love to talk about this topic with you and dive right in. But just before we do, I realize I forgot to say to you, how's the pod? And it's gone through changes, right?
Oh, well, yeah, we've gone through a lot of changes, and really quickly, something that has changed since maybe the last time I recorded with you guys, as a part of being diagnosed autistic myself, that kicked off a lot of self-exploration. So I now identify as non-binary, use they, them pronouns. And that's kind of hard because most of the world knows me as, Danielle with she, her pronouns, but I'm just going to put that out there. And yeah, that's one of the big changes. And the other one is that we decided to kind of narrow in on our podcast. We used to just make fun of evangelical pop culture for forever. And we kind of got tired of doing that. And basically, we wanted to hone in on what really is sort of my special interest, which is the indoctrination of children in evangelicalism in the United States from the 1970s on. So we're starting a project, like a book project that we decided not to go through traditional publishing to do. We're just publishing it on Substack. and doing a podcast, and that's called Strong Willed. So that's what we're up to.
Mm-hmm. And if listeners are familiar with that term, the strong-willed child from Dr. James Dobson, who started Focus on the Family, these sort of parenting techniques and childhood indoctrination is kind of spans the gamut, but that's one of those names in evangelicalism that was really well known for, here's how you discipline your kids to make sure that they stay in the faith and make sure that they obey authority. So that's really a lot of what we're digging into is those parenting practices and the impacts on a whole generation.
And for the purposes of this conversation, even our name, Strong-Willed, of our project, it really does have a lot to do with neurodivergence, because if you read this book that James Dobson wrote in 1977 called The Strong-Willed Child, most of the anecdotes he tells of these, what he calls little tyrants, dictators, these terrible little kids that must be, punished, they all seem very neurodivergent. And so that's just like one of the thread lines through this conversation is these kids that these Christian parenting experts were like, there's some kids that you just can't get them to obey right away. So how do you break their will, right, in a godly way? And most of those kids seem to be neurodivergent of some type. So that is sort of an undercurrent of our work too.
Yeah, it's all tied in. And it's interesting that you say break their wills in a godly way. So what is that? Like just bind them to slavery and get them to build pyramids? What does that mean? Break them in a godly way.
That you teach the kid, from infancy that they are sinners, that they are full of sin, that they are not good at their core, and they need an outside deity or an outside authority that they're consistently trying to appease, trying to obey. And especially if you grew up, in the United States, a part of that is also like you're fit into your assigned role at birth, right? And it's very specific to gender roles, specifically through Focus on the Family and all these groups. So it's just getting to comply to authority, recognizing that you're a sinner that really needs an outside authority to tell you what to do. And so our thesis at Strong Willed is not only was this a huge method of parenting that kind of bonded together all sorts of fundamentalist Christians in the United States and beyond, but also it was helpful to a specific political worldview, an authoritarian one, right? Where you train people that they need this authority figure, most likely a male authority figure that will come and swoop and save them and protect them and all this stuff. I mean, not to bring Hitler in too early, but right, the Fuhrer, the father, right, was the ultimate authority figure that would keep the people safe. And so he also was obsessed with disciplinary measures and the nuclear family. And if you can form this like patriarchal hierarchy in the family, when the kids grow up, they're more willing to accept that in society as a whole. And so sorry to get into the Hitler of it all a little too soon.
Well, I mean, that didn't really work out for him, did it? After all,
it did for a while. And a lot of people got hurt as the scapegoat, right? And so I think what's interesting in the United States and in any society where you kind of see this trend towards authoritarianism in the political sphere, right? You can still see those trends of who are they training people to be scared of? Who are they training people? This is who you should obey. This is who will protect you. And we obviously are seeing that play out in America in some really sobering ways and have since 2016. And so for us, our spiritual deconstruction really is tied to the political. And this is true for a lot of Americans. And I'm not sure, how it ties into all sorts of other countries. But for us, 2016 and the rise of this like very clearly authoritarian leader, right, caused us to be like, wait a minute, what's going on that the vast majority of white evangelicals are obsessed with this guy, right? Even though it doesn't match up to any of the stated values. But the underlying assumption of authority was there. And so I think that is also a part of why we want to do this project, is to say, why are so many Christians in America longing for an authoritarian leader? And I think the parenting methods that have been utilized in Christian spaces are something that just aren't often talked about. And I think it has a role to play. But sorry, this is not neurodivergence, except it is, because this is my special interest and I'm autistic. So there we go.
I think it is interesting because, I think the political right in America has always harnessed the evangelicals, always. But Trump took it to the next level. And he was really able to tap into that voter base in no way that has been able to be done before and continues to do so. I mean, I'm interested in your viewpoint. Obviously, you're in the middle of it, but it seems to be that people are doubling down in their support for Trump within the evangelical circles, actually not backing away. You're seeing others back away, and you're seeing key Republicans actually saying, we can't vote for this guy. He is fucked up. Yet you've got the lovers of Christ sitting there endorsing this guy and doubling down. What the fuck is happening over there?
Let's ask the person that is thinking about this like 200% more than I am.
Do you want my really quick spiel about why I think this happened?
100%.
Okay, so in the 1950s, there was a bunch of white Christian patriarchalists who were like, oh shit, other people are starting to get rights, right? Women are starting to get rights. The civil rights movement was happening. You go into the 60s, people start protesting America's militarization. They start protesting the Vietnam War. And all these guys were freaking out. They're like, what are we supposed to do? How are we going to keep control in an increasingly pluralistic society, right? Where there are minority people they're going to outnumber us eventually. And so they seem to have come up with this plan, right? Which is you start with the kids. And so you can look at articles from Christianity Today in the 50s and 60s. You can look at this cottage industry of Christians giving family and parenting advice. And they were all copying from these sort of growing the white family eugenicists that were also big in American culture for quite some time. And actually, the James Dobson connection, the guy who started Focus on the Family, his boss and mentor was the most famous eugenicist in American history who actually inspired the Third Reich and their policies, especially about forced sterilization. But he quickly realized after World War II, you can't just go around saying you're into eugenics, right? Saying that the white race is superior and we must do everything to promote them. So he's switched to what they call positive eugenics, focusing on growing the white family. Now, he was not a Christian. He was an avowed atheist. But Dobson still loved him, right? And grew up under him, was mentored by him. This guy, Popenoe, ended up writing the foreword to Dobson's first book, which was called Dare to Discipline, which is teaching Christian parents, you must dare to hit your child, right? Even though all the stuff coming out, Fred Rogers was around this time, like all the science was starting to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this to our kids. And Dobson's like, no, you have to. God wants you to do it. And it's the only way to get kids who will know how to submit to authority immediately, right? And if you can get them to do that to the parents, then they will obey the police. He was really into the police. They will obey the godly male Christian authorities who at that time were still in charge of America and most places, and they'll obey their churches.
Right.
And this is what he said. And it became this bestseller. And then it started this, like Christian publishing and the popularity of it. A lot of it comes down to these Christian parenting and family books, which were all positive eugenics and pro-corporal punishment books.
Right. And another piece is this was coming after the 60s where you're seeing white students protest on behalf of Black rights. And they're like, what is going on with these kids? Why aren't they obeying the authority? And Dobson comes in and says, it's not because you're not spanking your kids enough. And he wasn't the only one that was saying that either.
Yeah.
Right?
There's so many people. The guys who wrote the Left Behind books, they were big into writing Christian parenting manuals. And they were also obsessed with this idea that white kids were embarrassing their parents because they hadn't been spanked enough, right? They hadn't been trained as very young children how to submit to authority. And
to accept an authoritarian state.
Yeah.
Really
they
is,
were
right?
in these books, they often say we're not actually for democracy. Democracy is chaos, right? What you need is godly authority and God ordained structures, which of course are all about the man. So it's all patriarchal stuff too.
Didn't Tim LaHaye write anti-gay books as well?
Yes.
Well, because gender roles and gender norms are so important to these guys because that's what upholds the patriarchy. So yes, from very early on, they're obsessed with policing gender norms, gender roles, and anti-anything queer, right? Because that undoes the whole system of the man should be in charge, the woman should be under him, and then both the parents kind of lord over the children. So for me, the parenting stuff is connected to what we're seeing happen in the United States. And I just think it's a topic that hasn't got a ton of attention even though we all know, I mean, because we've lived it, right? What happens to you in childhood, even though we don't want it to, it does impact us. It shapes our lives. It doesn't mean you can't grow and heal and all that stuff, but I think it does a great disservice to kind of pretend like these things aren't pretty impactful.
That's a great summary, and I wasn't aware of some of that history, and I think that stuff is important because people just get on with their everyday lives, make decisions thinking that they're making these decisions with no pressure from history, from society or whatever, but this demonstrates absolutely this is the stuff that influences, it's pervasive, and people need to think before they actually take actions like voting for the Great Orange Man.
I wish they would. I doubt they will.
Yeah, I mean, there's research that shows that people that grew up in authoritarian parenting homes are more likely to vote for Trump.
Well, the research also shows that if you are like spanked and hit as a child, it impacts the way your prefrontal cortex develops and actually can stunt some of the development. And wait, you know it, there's also studies that show when your prefrontal cortex is impacted, it makes you more likely to turn to religious fundamentalism or extremist positions, right? Because in a way, it gives you a sense of safety. And this will actually go into our neurodivergence in the church conversation, is people who have brains that work a little bit differently. Maybe it's trauma, maybe it's neurodivergence. Sometimes what happens is people with these brains that are working differently, they are seeking psychological safety somewhere. And that's why, both Krispin and I sort of believe that a lot of neurodivergent people end up being drawn to high control religions like white evangelicalism because, well, there's a few different reasons, but one of them is I'm seeking that safety of this is who's in charge. God is in charge. This is who's in. A Christian's in. This is who's out. The non-Christians are out. And you also get a few other things like community benefits and all that. Okay, maybe we should also say, when we talk about neurodivergence, right, there's a few things we're talking about here. Troy, you mentioned being recently diagnosed ADHD. I have recently been diagnosed autistic. And I actually had the same experience in a way. Our child was first diagnosed. And then I went to therapy to learn how to be a better parent to an autistic child. And that therapist was like,
ding, 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 ding.
You really keep saying you're neurotypical. And we just need to ask ourselves a question. And actually, autism has been a part of my family for a long time. My older brother was diagnosed autistic in the 80s when it was very hard to get a diagnosis in America. And neurodivergence is genetic. There's a genetic component to it. So if someone in your family, right, has been diagnosed, you might want to start asking yourself some questions. And I actually am very passionate about destigmatizing autism in general because I think the word neurodivergence is becoming more acceptable. I think ADHD in some situations, there's a little bit more understanding. And autism is the one where people are like, no, I can't go there. I could never. I don't know anyone. You don't seem autistic. You just seem super weird and you make me feel uncomfortable and you're obsessed with what you're obsessed with and you're really annoying and I don't want to hang out with you, but you're not autistic.
You just described me.
Well, Troy, there's a lot of overlap between ADHD and autism. And I
don't agree. I think they're very separate and I think we should keep them separate.
Yeah, totally. And that's not ableism at all. It's
right.
like, no, it's not.
And something that I think is worth throwing in here is that, so DL is autistic. I've been working as a therapist with ADHD folks for over a decade. And so that is so I was working in an ADHD clinic. Then we found out, hey, our kid is autistic. Oh, I'm going to learn more about autism. Oh, all these ADHDers, not all, a large portion of these ADHDers that I diagnosed with ADHD and just because of the limits of my own education, wasn't really on the radar for autism. I started to realize like, oh, actually I'm working with a lot of autistic folks. So actually I spend a lot of my week, I do various types of therapy, but I do couples therapy where one or both partners are neurodivergent, so autistic or ADHD. So, and I've worked with individuals forever. So that's sort of where I'm coming from in this story. I also have some neurodivergent traits myself. I relate to a lot of my clients. I'm still sorting that out, but But I feel like I hold the stories of so many people that have been just gracious enough to, work with me and tell me about what it's like to be neurodivergent, to grow up with ADHD, and then learning more in recent years about autism as well.
Yeah. And so for me, like thinking about this podcast, thinking about your audience, thinking about the title of your podcast, right? I was a teenage fundamentalist. To me, that sets off, right? These ding, ding, ding little autism bells, right? Like for a while there, my newsletter was called God is My Special Interest, right? Because I was thinking about how many autistic people are drawn to the church, right? Where you can be all in on something, right? You can just let your little freak flag fly, be all into this thing. Plus you get a community, right? You get rules for how to be a person, how to be a good person.
Right. And if you talk about God, like if you talk about the Cowboys all the time, people are going to be like, does Troy talk about anything other than the Cowboys?
That's right.
But if you talk about God all the time, like nobody can touch that, right? It's like
you're just a really, really holy person.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
I remember someone said to me years ago, they said, "Oh, you've just got an addictive personality." And I got really offended by that. It's like, how dare you? I've got an addictive personality, yada, yada. Now I realized, no. Neurodivergence, right? And to be honest, this guy was in IT and he was somewhere on some spectrum himself. It's funny how we just point it all out. Like I work for an IT company and I'm not the usual IT person, although I am now. And it's funny, found my way to my tribe, but I used to run workshops on accessibility, right? Using technology to open up doors for people with disabilities. And I used to talk about ADHD. And I'd get up there and I'd run these workshops and I think to myself, imagine what it must be like to have ADHD. And seriously, I actually ran workshops for people with ADHD while having ADHD, right? And yeah, here we are. Mm-hmm. And for what it's worth, my wife, I mean, I don't want to out her too much on this, but, we're looking at her going, oh, you don't like loud noises. Oh, you don't like crowds. Oh, all this kind of stuff. And it's like, maybe small a, here we are. This is it.
Yeah. And I just think for the people who are drawn to your podcast, who are listening to this, it's just worth thinking about. It's worth exploring. It's worth being curious about. And we don't have to be scared, right, about these labels. One of the things that Marlene Weinell talks about in her book, Leaving the Fold, when talking about Christian fundamentalists, is they have such a lack of self-awareness, right, about themselves and how they are in the world. And so I am very passionate about anything that is allowing you to have more self-awareness, especially if you grew up as a child in fundamentalist movements, is a really great thing. And so I'm just here to say, let's talk about missionaries for a second. You guys have experience with missionaries, and I'm wondering if looking back, if any of those folks seem like they could maybe be autistic.
One of my very best friends who couldn't handle it when I deconstructed and walked away is still a missionary and is so deep on the autism spectrum. I mean, his own children have been diagnosed with autism, we're talking not very high functioning. And he and his wife, full missionaries, but totally. And now that I hear that, weren't you a missionary for a while, DL?
Me? Yeah, because guess what? I'm a literal minded thinker. And so when I grew up with an evangelical pastor dad and a mom who was like, listen, y'all, if you're not a Christian, you're going to hell. And I was like, well, then I will do everything in my power, my every thought. I was in agony thinking about people going to hell. So yeah, I fucking became a missionary because I actually believed it. And I couldn't understand why so many Christians believed in hell and did nothing about it. And
yeah, well, you, me, and Keith Green, right? You, me, and Keith Green.
Talk about autistic.
Do you see all the people sinking
no
down?
Compromise. Like, that was so me. You know what I mean? Just like, there's this safety in being like, we will be perfect and we will reach the masses. And I have a lot of like love for people who take the Bible literally and who take evangelical theology literally, because they're actually in a lot of anguish, in my personal experience, a lot of existential anguish. And so one of the ways you deal with that is by doing what the church says to do, to go and reach people, to save the lost, to help them, into this loving relationship with this loving God who will take away all their pain and fear and anxiety. And it took me until I was in my 30s where I was like, what the hell? I have so much anxiety. I have so much pain. I have so much suffering. Every Christian I know in my life, they say they're getting this peace and all this stuff from God, but like none of it's actually working. It took me so long to come to that because I was autistic, born into this system where I was told a million billion times that this was good news. A personal relationship with Jesus did work, and everybody needed it to go to heaven. So I just think there's a lot of us little literal-minded folks that are funneled into seminary, into missions, into these spaces.
If I had $1 for every deliverance session I went to, because I thought it must be demons, because I was doing everything right. I was evangelizing, I was reading my Bible, and I used to go and flail around on the floor, trying to get these demons out of me because I just had no peace. And that was exactly, turned out I had an anxiety disorder. But no, it couldn't be that. You have Jesus, so it must be demons.
It couldn't be God. It had to be you, right? And that is the saddest, most common story of the undiagnosed neurodivergence, right? Is it can't be the system. It must be me. And you internalize that shame, right? And you internalize all the problems. It's the hallmark of kids who grow up in abusive homes, right? CPTSD. You internalize the shame instead of looking critically at the system and what it's saying and how it's not working. You turn it inside. And so that is sadly a really common story for people who are autistic or ADHD in the church. And the church just says over and over again, this will work. And who's most likely to believe that? People who've experienced trauma, people who are prone to addictions, right? And I love this idea of this is the one that'll fix all the pain, right? And I believe neurodivergent people. Now, there needs to be so many more studies done on this. There's not tons out there right now about high control religions or religion in general and neurodivergence, but that's something I really hope we will see in the future, that they actually do some studies looking at who's drawn to these kinds of organizations. And the sad truth is, I think a lot of neurodivergent folks are exploited by churches because of all these things we just talked about.
Right.
When I tried to do some research on this, and I was using ChatGPT, and it was like the articles that it was pulling up were actually Christianity Today articles from some point in time about scrupulosity and its connection to autism. But there was, you're right, Danielle, there's so little written on it about, from some places that we could trust. And actually it was written, as I said, they were published in Christianity Today, so you possibly wrote those articles yourself.
I was going to say, did I write? Because I know it. I knew an editor at CT when I was still working there, and this was right before they kicked me out for being LGBTQ plus affirming. But he's the first person who told me about scrupulosity, and he was like, "It's this thing," and actually Luther maybe had it, And he's telling me about this, and I was like, oh my God, I think I have that. Like, I'm obsessed with ethics and Christian ethics and thinking through the problems of the world. And I just brushed it off. Of course I did, It's just like, no, you're fine. Keep going. Keep doing the thing. But it's very interesting because we do see so many of these connections. I think so many of the famous Christian theologians and ethicists, right, had something like moral scrupulosity, where you just get obsessive about thinking through who's good, what's bad, what's good, what's wrong. Like it's much more common, and that labor and that internal labor and internal anguish has been used and exploited, right, by religion,
right,
to continue it on.
Yeah. And so there is that piece, the scrupulosity with missionaries, something that I want to make sure we mention, because I grew up a missionary kid around a lot of missionaries, is for autistic folks, knowing non-autistic social cues can be a challenge. Yeah. Right. And so there are lots of ways to frame it. But, we know that, like, for autistic folks, a lot of times it's like, here's this social norm that I don't get or I don't understand, et cetera. But if you're in another culture, people just lay it out for you. And so that was my experience of a lot of the missionaries I knew were like really thrived in an environment where the social cues are not a given. And so there needs to be an explicit conversation.
Also, it's okay if they miss social cues because they are a transplant. And that was a lot of my life in my early 20s. I was living and working in refugee communities here in the United States, and I could just be my little weirdo self. And they're like, yeah, because you're not Somali. That's why. And it was just a way to hide how
That's
little
why.
I fit into parts of American culture.
That's why you didn't fit in.
That's got to be it.
It's an interesting space. Like Troy and I have often reflected about the people that we grew up with in church and how many of those were neurodiverse and how it is that
How many of them were not? Do you know what I mean? That's more the question, isn't it?
Easier to count.
Isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, so many people you go, oh, fuck, they were weird, or fuck, they were clingers, or they had no social graces, and yeah, there was lots of them. And I don't know if you guys might not have seen, but Troy and I went back to church. I don't know if you know this. So
I really want to hear your thoughts on it. I haven't listened to it yet.
I almost listened to it and I was like, I don't know if this is going to trigger me or not.
That's what I thought too. I'm sorry.
Well, we take the piss. My partner actually comes there with us, but and she has never been a Christian. Has been exposed to churches, but more traditional type churches. So it was getting her reflections too and pretty much the whole thing. She was like, what the fuck? What the fuck? I actually didn't understand what they were doing or saying, or I didn't know where they were trying to take me. But we sat in amongst it, and I'd be interested from your point, Troy, because I know that afterwards you went, oh, fuck, how good would it be to have this community? Because you can see when you're there, even though it's messed up, like it's so messed. Like honestly, from the viewpoint of now, like it had been 27 years since I'd walked in the doors of that church. I went back, a completely different person going, I don't get it. I just totally don't get it. My heart is obviously too hard. But going back in as someone who is aware of their neurodiversity and some of those things that pulled you in, Troy, and some of those things that held you in, what are your reflections on going back to church knowing that now?
Oh my God, where to begin? Do you know what was the biggest tell for me sitting through that service? How excruciatingly long it was, and sitting in the same place. And I remembered, like, even as a teenager, because I was a teenage fundamentalist, right? I didn't go in as a really young person. I went in as a teen. Sitting through services was excruciatingly hard. And I used to have to go to the toilet 2 and 3 times. But of course, the more spiritual you were, the more you stayed. And so even just getting up and needing to walk around was just nuts. So that was a really judgy thing. But it was interesting this time being there, and I was listening to the podcast episode of you and I. And by the way, guys, hilarious, right? Really, it's so much fun because we do totally take the piss. And remember, Danielle, take the piss, not a piss. And
thank you. I needed that.
Yes.
But I did that too. I went to the toilet 4 or 5 times. I got up and walked out.
You did
all
both.
All the neurodivergent people are in the foyer, which is where I used to be. I used to wander in and out. And Brian was sitting there going, do you remember this? Do you remember that? And I'm like, no, this is just a couple of weeks ago, right? And he's like, do you remember when this happened? Do you remember? No. Where was I? I was on my phone. We didn't have those back in the day, but I was up, I was moving, I was distracted. I couldn't sit still. I have ADHD, and now it all makes sense. But the guilt of having to get up and leave, and I used to get told off for getting up and leaving by people that weren't even my parents.
Well, I mean, what's so interesting is there's so many things to unpack there. One of the things is this cycle of guilt and shame that is built into these kinds of services, right? If you don't stay the whole time, you're not that spiritual, right? Gives you another thing to internalize, another thing to be like, well, if the Holy Spirit really was in my life, wouldn't I like love every second of this sweaty 4-hour whatever? But then there's some neurodivergent people who do seem to get a lot out of it. It's like a vocal stimming, right? Like there's many kinds of stimming that can happen inside a church service. Plus there is this sense of I am doing something that connects me to a community, right? And I think for a lot of neurodivergent people, you have this sense of being other, of being outside, of always looking in, of always there being something wrong with you. And then you join this community that explicitly says, if you say this, this, and this, and you come to the services, you are in. And then the service becomes a part of like proving that you're a part of this community. And yet it's also instilling guilt and shame at the exact same time, creating this sort of like cyclical nature.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that as I was thinking about this, thinking about the ADHD folks that I worked with, that shame of like, there's something wrong with me. I'm falling behind. I can't follow instructions. I'm doing impulsive things. I'm getting in trouble. all of that really fits with the Christian narrative of there's something really wrong with you and you really need to be saved, or you're loved even though you're a total
piece of shit.
Right, exactly. And I think that really resonates with people that have felt like outsiders, that have felt like I can't keep up, or, I keep on doing something wrong. I don't know. Or, maybe I do things wrong and I do know, right? Like it's hard for me to like sit still in Sunday school class. And that means I'm not a good Christian. With ADHDers, we talk a lot about the moralization of behavior, right? And just across society, right? You're a good kid or a bad kid. But then we look at the church and how that is turned up to 10.
Yes, totally.
That moralization of behavior, right?
The other one I used to get was, Troy, you're very smart, but you're not very wise. And what that really said to me was, like, intelligence, well, that's natural. That comes from the brain. But wisdom, see, that comes from God and it's the Spirit. Yeah. And so even that was, Troy, you're just not very spiritual. And it used to kill me because I just totally felt I was lacking, the whole time. And that's another thing that I wanted to bring up with you guys. And so forgive me if it's too early, but have you stopped and reinterpreted everything that you sort of went through in church now through neurodivergent eyes, DL? Because I'm looking back now going, did it hurt so much when I got rejected by the church because of rejection sensitive dysphoria? Or did it hurt so much because it was really bad? Or is it a combination of both? And should I be forgiving those people because they were cunts to me? Or should I actually be forgiving them because I have rejection sensitive dysphoria? By the way, we say cunt now on our show.
Can you explain to me what that means? Can you explain to me what that means? I'm missing a social cue here. No, just kidding.
Yeah. It's a really old English word that used to once upon a time be a fine word, but it's not anymore. So this is the thing, right? That's what Brian says. This is the thing. I don't know how to interpret this of what I brought, what was what they brought, what was the fucked upness of having this and trying to fit into just a normal society, forget the church, or what is, and should I be reinterpreting this? Because at the end of the day, I go, yeah, but they're supposed to have the Holy Spirit, and so they should have known better, right? Like if God's there, then what, really, I mean, God's giving words to people about, you've got, this bit of judginess in your heart. But if you really want to impress me, God, why don't you give the word to someone and show them how to cure cancer, right? Or say, Fred down there is actually, messing with children, or Mary over there is neurodivergent and you need to treat her better. None of that comes in these words from God. Anyway, I'm pissed. Sorry.
Well, it's funny that you should say that, because I think when I was diagnosed autistic, that really helped me eventually be able to leave Christianity when I didn't feel like I was able to, just because of the programming I had received and because of my own context growing up as a child of a pastor and everything. I had been told from birth that God talked to my parents, right? And that everything they said was true and right. And that stuff was so deeply ingrained in me. Again, I don't know if it's autism, but that seems to make me more vulnerable. Both of my sisters did not believe that God talked to my mom and that the end was really coming and that they should be missionary.
They were just like, yeah, that's a weird thing that mom keeps talking about, but it didn't land in the
and
same
so
way.
My entire mind was just, I had no sense of the future. I had no sense of myself. I had no sense of anything outside of I must be nothing. God must be everything. If I had anxiety, right, it was because, I must have thought about myself today instead of God. That's why I'm anxious and dreading going to work, and it's just so sad. And now I'm angry. I'm very, very, very angry about how I was exploited. I was a true believer, okay? Because one, it was beaten into me, literally. Two, right? Everything in my life was around this, becoming a Christian, serving God, becoming a missionary. And the church just took everything it could get from me. And the second I started to have mental health problems, right? They're gone. Everybody's gone. Nobody wants to help you. It's your fault. You must not be doing it right. Now, I went to a Pentecostal college for like a hot minute, and I could not speak in tongues. So this is the story I've rethought about in light of my autism diagnosis, right? It's a 4-square Bible college. Everybody's speaking in tongues. I'm like, I know lots of people who do. I don't. I'm going to wait until it's like a supernatural thing from God. Everybody was pulling me aside saying, just just make it up. Like you just say words and then it
Just
gets
say hallelujah really
and then
fast.
it gets rolling and then things start happening. And I was like, well, that doesn't sound very supernatural at all. And nor does it match up to what's happening in the book of Acts. So no, like it's got to be from God. They had prayer times over me all the time. You know, one of my professors came and prophesied over me in front of everyone that I was blocking the Holy Spirit with the sin in my life. Y'all, I was the least sinning person on that campus. I will tell you that right now. And now looking back, I'm just like, what the fuck were all these adults doing? Like, I was the most precious, pure-hearted, true believer. And the second I started to ask questions, right, that would have poked a hole in the whole thing, right? I was the problem. And that's just been the story of my life for decades. And, you know, that kind of adds up and really impacts your sense of self. And I have a really hard time trusting people, making friendships. And I know lots of neurodivergent people have that too. So for me, I'm just allowing myself to be a little bit angry and see how I was exploited, you know?
100%. And one thing that Troy and I often sort of ponder is what people's intentions were. So people in power, were they intentionally exploiting people? Were they intentionally manipulating people? Or did they truly believe deep down that this was the way and that you would have been the problem, DL? There has to be something blocking in your life because the system doesn't fail, only humans do. What do you think about that? Do you think people intentionally did it or there was a naivety?
I think about this all the time. And I have my weird little theory, and I definitely want to hear from both you and, you know, Krispin weigh in too. Krispin's known about this for forever because I was like a Christian writer, right? Because I believed all this and I was like, evangelicals are being so fucking stupid. I got to tell them that they're not actually loving their neighbors, right? So that was my whole writing career. And I would go to these conferences with all these progressive Christians and oh my God, some of those people were the biggest hot messes and they were hypocrites and phonies. And I was astonished, right? I was shell shocked.
Which, by the way, this is like a replaying of you in high school when you were telling on the worship band members who were smoking marijuana.
I was so mad. The cool worship leaders all smoked marijuana and I was like, kick them off. And then my youth pastor was like, you're such a little judgmental Pharisee. And I was like, oh my God. Anywho.
So this is who DL has been their
always.
whole life.
And so at these progressive Christian things, I couldn't handle it. But really, to me, it was like half and half. It was half true believers and half charlatans, half people who were like, this is how I make my money. This is how I get acclaim. This is how I get attention. And so I'm not saying it's always 50-50, but I sort of started to realize there's the true believers and there's the people who are doing it for totally different reasons and they manipulate people. And unfortunately, right, we kind of see that, especially in like positions of power. Sometimes it's a true believer, but more often than not, it's sort of the charlatan that gets that main position, right? And gets all the accolades. And so that has been how I'm seeing it. Mm-hmm. And now I'm like, I'm not sure it's a great way to go through life because I'm trying not to obsess about Christians anymore and what they do. But I'm curious if that resonates with you guys at all.
You know, I left over 20-something, nearly 30 years ago. So good luck with that.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that comes to mind for me is there are some indications that people that are church planters have higher rates of narcissism. And so it just makes sense to me that there are a lot of people in power positions and leader positions that are narcissistic. And then what you were saying earlier, how many people are not neurodivergent in the church, right? Like there's so many people that are showing up on Sunday morning that it's so meaningful to them. This is their way of this is how they make sense of their life, of meaning, of dealing with how horrible the world is. I think that's another piece that we didn't even really touch on, but I think for you, like, how do the world is full of suffering. And in my experience, autistic folks are very attuned to that. The neurotypical folks we have stories about like why this happens or like, why this person is living on the street and this person has a mansion and stuff. But what I find with talking to autistic folks often is like, they're like, I see this in this clear way where it's like, this doesn't make sense to me. Like, why is this suffering happening? they just sort of see it clearly. And I think that is your experience.
Yeah, a strong sense of justice is a trait that many autistic people have, and it can cause you such anguish. And so for me, progressive Christianity was like, yes, there's suffering. Yes, there's injustice. Jesus makes everything better. If we just follow Jesus, like the world will become more just. And that helped me a lot. Like, okay.
Right. So if I show up on Sunday morning to help set up church because this church is really doing great justice work, right? It's really easy to to exploit people because they really want to see the world better.
So speaking of a sense of justice, I have always had that. And especially when it's something is done to me or to people I love, or it's just really, really blatant. And one of the things that I did was because ChatGPT is now my friend. I remember I work in tech, right? So I got out ChatGPT and I said, I typed in these words: is there such thing as an overactive sense of justice? That's what I typed in. And it came back with all these articles from Attitude Magazine, which is ADD Magazine, basically steering to, yes, this is a common symptom of ADHD, blah, blah, blah. And I was just like, oh, wow. And I'm showing my wife going, see, I'm not, because even after I got my diagnosis, I'm still like, well, maybe they got it wrong and maybe I don't. And maybe this is just an excuse. But it was like, there it is again. And, and the scrupulosity. Sorry, you want to diagnose me, Krispin? Go ahead.
Yes, I was like, can we keep track of the autistic traits that you're mentioning? I just got to say this. As someone sort of in the research, the research shows that most ADHDers have at least one significant autistic trait. Now, the reason that those have been so separated is because up until 10 years ago, you couldn't be both. You couldn't be diagnosed with both. You
could not be diagnosed.
So you couldn't be. So that means that even when I started at the ADHD clinic, I was hearing from these experts in the field. But they were like, oh, yeah, I've been working with ADHD folks forever, and they have sensory sensitivities, and they have justice sensitivity, and they have trouble with social cues. And those are all autistic traits. But because they've been diagnosed with ADHD, they couldn't be autistic. So really, these two arenas were siloed, and there's really so much overlap between them, which I think is just important for people to know, to say hey, if you've been diagnosed with ADHD, maybe look at some autistic traits because you might have some of those and it might be a better way of understanding yourself and understanding what you need to thrive.
Brian, this is a really good episode and it's another long one. So how about we pause this now and end this episode and let's drop this next week, not even having to wait 2 weeks. What do you reckon?
Yeah, let's do it. It's always a great time having a chat with the Mayfield. So we don't want to shorten this episode, but also here's a gift. We'll give you the 2. If you'd like to connect with the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast, then please see the links in our link tree in the show notes. We invite you to join our listener community on Facebook, and we're also on Instagram, X, and Reddit. Check out our merch on Redbubble. We've got t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and all kinds of great evangelical stuff that you can wear proudly. All proceeds go to building and promoting the podcast. We want to give a huge shout out to our Patreon supporters. Subscribers get a range of benefits, including free merch, early access to episodes, access to our exclusive subscribers group, and monthly bonus content. Again, all proceeds of this go to the running and promotion cost of the podcast. A special thanks to Ava, who manages our social strategy, and also to Kerry and Bree, who manage our Facebook listener group, and also to Bree, who puts out our monthly newsletter on Substack. All of our episodes are transcribed by Leanne to increase accessibility. The show is produced and hosted by Brian McDowell and Troy Waller. The sound engineering for this episode was done by Jonathan O'Brien. I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist is available wherever you find your podcasts. Again, you can find all our links in our link tree in the show notes. Or why don't you pop across to our website at www.iwasateenagefundamentalist.com